Hey, my name is Michael, and today I'm going to be doing an overview of business communication. Um, I'll start off by establishing what communication is and the communication cycle, as well as how that applies to the business setting, and then talk a little bit about the different types of communication, such as verbal, nonverbal, intercultural communication, ethical communication, and then we're going to talk about some strategies for communicating effectively. So at the core, communication is simply just the process of sending and receiving messages. So communication is a little bit more than just the process of sending and receiving messages. In fact, communication has something called the communication cycle. Now, the communication cycle, you have a sender, a message, a receiver, and a response. The sender is the person that is sending the message as well, the message. The receiver is the person receiving the message, and then the response is the receiver following up with the sender. Now, there are many forms of communication, but the basic being nonverbal and verbal communication. Nonverbal communication is body language, such as body posture, eye contact, touch, tone of voice, facial expressions, and verbal communication is communication with your voice. Now, an interesting fact, according to helpguide.org, people pay more attention to your nonverbal cues than they do to your verbal cues. So the way you say things matter, and the facial expressions and where you are looking all has an effect on that person's perception of you. So you need to be really careful about that. Now, an important thing to understand is that nonverbal and verbal communication both have barriers. So, some verbal communication barriers are inadequate knowledge on a subject, misinterpretation, people interpreting things differently, language difference, poor expressions, improper use of slang, using technical jargon that not everyone understands, or over abstraction and ambiguity. Some nonverbal barriers are perception, which is how people view you, conflicting signals, where maybe you're saying one thing but your body language shows something else, inappropriate emotions, getting overwhelmed or sad or angry, or distractions like sound or television in the background. Now, on a more complex level, you have technology-based communication, which incorporates email, phone, voicemail, text messaging, and social media. So now that we've talked about the different types of communication, let's talk a little bit about ethical communication. Ethical communication is very important in a business setting because people need to feel honored and respected. There are things that you shouldn't and should say in a business setting, and if you lack good ethical communication, it could result in unemployment or even legal action. So to maintain ethical communication, here are a couple of things that you should avoid in the workplace. Racial slurs, slang, any mentions of violence, any form of sexual harassment, any religious topics, or inappropriate posts on social media. These are all unethical behaviors, and usually companies have in place rules specifically for this, but there are also social aspects to it. Not everything is strictly prohibited, but there are just things that you should understand that you shouldn't do at any time, whether that is in a business setting or out in public. From an ethical standpoint, businesses expect you to have a decent level of intercultural communication. Businesses want you to embrace diversity and understand cultural differences. People communicate differently all around the world, and in a business setting, you're going to be coming into contact with this quite frequently. So it's important to kind of understand how people communicate differently. For example, in China, it's all about humility. Here in America, it's the complete opposite. It's always about explaining all the achievements that you have. Now, if you're having a conversation with someone from China, they may see this as boastful and it may turn them off to your conversation. So that's why it's real important to understand the different forms of cultures. So we understand the different types of communication and how to communicate ethically, but how do we communicate effectively? Now, some things to take into consideration when communicating effectively is most importantly, be clear. Be decisive. Make sure that you are getting your point across. And a good way to do that is to fit the communication tool to your audience. Make sure you're using the right form of communication that best fits your audience. You want to sometimes have conversations face to face, whereas other times maybe you should send an email. It all just depends on the situation. Have good conflict resolution. In a business setting, you are going to come across conflict, and the worst thing you could do is avoid it. It needs to be approached directly. But you have to work together. Teamwork makes the dream work. So think of the problem as a group problem and work on it together. Try to see something from other people's point of views. And most importantly, encourage everyone as a group. Have an understanding of feedback and a realistic view on it. Understand that sometimes you need feedback and sometimes you need to give feedback. Now, sometimes that feedback could be positive or negative, but the point is feedback is necessary. So to recap, in a business setting, you want to maintain good ethical communication by understanding what to do, what to say, what not to do, what not to say, having a good understanding of intercultural communication, communicating effectively, making sure you're clear, using proper expressions and body language, and understanding the different forms of communication, whether that be verbal, nonverbal, or technology based. And most importantly, just be polite. Thank you.